The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red tunic and checked his rifle one final time. For 12 years, he had stood guard at various royal residences, maintaining the stoic expression that had become second nature to him. His weathered face showed no emotion as tourists gathered behind the rope barriers, cameras clicking incessantly. Morrison had seen it all during his service. Countless visitors tried everything imaginable to make the guards react. People would tell jokes, make funny faces, even attempt to touch the guards or their equipment. Through it all, Morrison and his colleagues remained motionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead, embodying the discipline and tradition that made the Queen's Guard legendary worldwide. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, the usual crowd of tourists began forming around 10 o'clock. Morrison took his position at the main entrance, his bearskin hat adding to his imposing 6-foot frame. The familiar routine began. Tourists posing for photos, children staring in wonder at his colorful uniform, and the occasional attempt to provoke a reaction. Among the crowd, Morrison noticed a young family from what sounded like Australia based on their accents. The father carried a camera while the mother held the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. The child clutched a small, well-worn teddy bear with brown fur that had clearly seen many adventures. The bear wore a tiny red jacket that matched Morrison's uniform, complete with miniature gold buttons. The family approached the barrier, and Morrison could hear their conversation without shifting his gaze. The father was explaining to his daughter about the guards and their important job protecting the Queen. The little girl listened with wide eyes, occasionally whispering questions to her mother about the soldier man and his big fuzzy hat. After taking several photos, the family began to move toward the palace gates for a better view of the changing of the guard ceremony. Morrison continued his duty, aware of their presence but maintaining his professional demeanor. The morning proceeded normally until he heard a distressed cry from somewhere behind the growing crowd. "Teddy! Where's Teddy?" The little girl's voice carried clearly across the courtyard, filled with the kind of panic that only a child separated from a beloved toy could feel. Morrison's trained hearing picked up the family's increasingly frantic search. The mother's voice grew more urgent as she called out, asking nearby tourists if they had seen a small brown bear. Through his peripheral vision, Morrison could see the family retracing their steps, the father lifting barriers to look underneath, while the mother questioned other visitors. The little girl's sobs grew louder, and Morrison could hear her explaining between tears that Teddy was her best friend and couldn't sleep without him. The crowd around Morrison continued their usual attempts to get his attention, unaware of the drama unfolding nearby. A group of teenagers posed for selfies, making exaggerated facial expressions, while an elderly man told his grandson about the last time he had visited the palace 50 years earlier. Morrison remained perfectly still, but his mind was entirely focused on the distressed child's cries. After 20 minutes of searching, Morrison heard the father suggesting they contact the palace security office to report the lost item. The mother agreed, though her voice suggested little hope of recovery. They began walking toward the Visitor Information Center, the little girl trailing behind, her sobs now reduced to quiet hiccups. As the family moved away from his post, Morrison caught a glimpse of brown fur partially hidden beneath a discarded newspaper near the base of a lamppost, about 15 feet to his left. The teddy bear lay motionless, its tiny red jacket slightly askew, clearly dropped during the family's photo session. Morrison faced a dilemma that tested every rule of his training. His duty required absolute stillness and silence during his watch. Breaking character was strictly forbidden and could result in disciplinary action. Yet 20 feet away, a small child was heartbroken over losing her cherished companion, while the solution lay within his sight. For several minutes, Morrison wrestled with the decision. He watched other tourists walk past the lamppost, none noticing the small bear hidden beneath the debris. The family had disappeared toward the information center, and Morrison knew that by the time they returned with security personnel, the bear might be gone or overlooked entirely. The guards' training emphasized duty above all else, but Morrison had been a father once. His own daughter had passed away from leukemia 8 years earlier, and he remembered the comfort her stuffed animals had provided during those difficult final months. The memory of Sarah's attachment to her own teddy bear made his decision clear. When the next wave of tourists moved toward the east gate for a better view of the ceremony, Morrison made his choice. In one fluid motion, he stepped from his post, walked quickly to the lamp post, and retrieved the teddy bear. He brushed off the dust and straightened its tiny jacket before returning to his position, the bear now concealed behind his back. The entire operation took less than 30 seconds, but Morrison's heart pounded as though he had run a marathon. No one in the remaining crowd seemed to notice his brief absence, but he knew palace security cameras had recorded everything. He would face questions later, but the thought of that little girl's tears made the risk worthwhile. Morrison waited, the teddy bear pressed against his back, hidden from view. 10 minutes passed before he spotted the family returning with a security officer. They retraced their path, the official examining the ground while the parents looked increasingly dejected. The little girl walked between them, occasionally calling out "Teddy" in a voice that broke Morrison's heart. As they approached his post, Morrison made eye contact with the security officer, a colleague he had known for several years. Without moving his head, Morrison glanced downward slightly, then back up. The officer, experienced in reading the subtle communications guards sometimes used, understood immediately. "Let me check around this area more thoroughly," the officer told the family, moving toward Morrison's position. As he approached, Morrison shifted slightly, allowing the teddy bear to fall to the ground behind his feet. "Well, look what we have here," the officer announced, bending down to retrieve the bear. "This little fellow was hiding right behind our guard." The little girl's scream of joy echoed across the courtyard as she ran forward, her parents close behind. The officer handed over the teddy bear, and the child hugged it tightly, covering its fuzzy face with kisses while thanking the nice man repeatedly. The mother looked directly at Morrison, though his eyes remained fixed straight ahead. "Thank you," she whispered, somehow knowing that the guard had played a role in the bear's miraculous appearance. Morrison gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible, but enough to acknowledge her gratitude. As the family walked away, the little girl turned back one last time. She waved at Morrison with her teddy bear's paw, making the toy dance in the air. "Bye-bye, soldier man," she called out. "Teddy says thank you, too." Morrison maintained his stoic expression, but inside, he felt a warmth that no amount of training could suppress. The risk he had taken was worth seeing the joy return to that small face. Some rules, he realized, were meant to be broken when kindness demanded it. The rest of his shift passed without incident, though Morrison found himself thinking about his own daughter and wondering if she would have approved of his actions. When the changing of the guard ceremony began, he marched with his usual precision, but his steps felt lighter somehow. Later that evening, Morrison was summoned to his commanding officer's office. The security footage had indeed captured his brief departure from his post. As he stood at attention, Morrison prepared for the disciplinary action that would surely follow. "Sergeant Morrison," his captain began, reviewing the incident report, "I understand there was an unusual situation during your watch today." "Yes, sir," Morrison replied, ready to accept responsibility for his actions. The captain studied the footage on his computer screen, then looked up at Morrison. "It appears you helped reunite a child with her lost toy." "I did, sir. I accept full responsibility for leaving my post." The captain leaned back in his chair, considering his response. Sergeant, in 30 years of service, I've learned that sometimes our humanity must take precedence over our regulations. That little girl will remember this day for the rest of her life, and she'll tell her children about the kind guard who helped her find her teddy bear." Morrison remained silent, unsure of where the conversation was heading. "There will be no disciplinary action," the captain continued. "However, I trust this was an exceptional circumstance and won't become a habit." "Understood, sir. Thank you, sir." As Morrison left the office, he felt a profound sense of relief and validation. The rigid facade required of his position had cracked just enough to let his humanity shine through, and rather than being punished, he had been reminded that compassion and duty could coexist. The story of the guard and the teddy bear spread quietly among the palace staff, becoming one of those unofficial tales that reminded everyone why they served. It wasn't just about protecting buildings or following protocols. It was about serving something greater, something that included showing kindness to a heartbroken child when the moment demanded it. Morrison continued his service with renewed purpose, understanding that true strength sometimes meant knowing when to bend the rules for the greater good. The memory of that little girl's joy became a treasure he carried with him, a reminder that even in the most formal circumstances, there was always room for human kindness. Corporal David Chen had been looking forward to this Saturday for months, but not for the reasons one might expect from a young man in his mid-20s. While his friends planned weekend adventures and his girlfriend Sarah had hoped for a romantic day together, Chen was scheduled for what he considered one of the highest honors in the Queen's Guard, standing watch during a royal wedding at Windsor Castle. The wedding of a minor royal had attracted international attention, with guests from around the world arriving to witness the ceremony. Chen had spent weeks preparing, polishing his uniform to perfection, and rehearsing the precise movements required for such a prestigious assignment. For a guard who had only been in service for 3 years, this represented a significant milestone in his career. What made this day even more special for Chen was a personal connection that few people knew about. Sarah Mitchell, his girlfriend of 2 years, worked as a florist in the nearby town of Windsor. Her small shop had been selected to provide some of the floral arrangements for the wedding reception, a contract that represented the biggest opportunity of her young career. Sarah had spent months planning the arrangements, working with the royal event coordinators to create designs that would complement the castle's historic grandeur while reflecting the couple's personal style. She had poured her heart into every detail, from the color palette to the specific varieties of roses she would cultivate in her greenhouse. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they would both be working at the same event, but would be unable to acknowledge each other's presence. Chen would be stationed in his ceremonial position, maintaining the stoic demeanor required of the Queen's Guard, while Sarah would be busy with her floral duties, ensuring everything was perfect for the photographers and guests. On the morning of the wedding, Chen arrived at Windsor Castle before dawn for final preparations and briefings. His position would be at the main entrance to St. George's Chapel, where he would stand guard as guests arrived and departed. The location offered him a clear view of the chapel steps, where the couple would pose for photographs after the ceremony. Sarah arrived 2 hours later with her team of assistants, her van loaded with carefully arranged bouquets and centerpieces. Chen caught a glimpse of her unloading flowers near the service entrance, her face glowing with excitement and nervous energy. She wore her best black dress and had styled her usually casual brown hair into an elegant updo for the occasion. As guests began arriving, Chen took his position and assumed the familiar stance that had become second nature. His rifle held precisely at the correct angle, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his expression neutral and professional. The morning sun highlighted the gold threads in his red tunic as distinguished guests walked past, many pausing to admire the traditional ceremony of the guard. Through his peripheral vision, Chen occasionally spotted Sarah moving efficiently between the chapel and reception areas, checking arrangements and making last-minute adjustments. Her dedication to perfection matched his own commitment to duty, and he felt a surge of pride watching her professional expertise in action. The ceremony proceeded flawlessly, with Chen maintaining his post as hundreds of guests filled the chapel. He could hear the organ music and occasional applause from inside, marking the significant moments of the service. His training allowed him to remain focused despite the emotional significance of the day and the knowledge that Sarah was working just a few hundred yards away. When the ceremony concluded, the chapel doors opened and the wedding party emerged onto the steps for photographs. Chen had a perfect view of the proceedings as the couple posed with their families, the photographer directing various groupings while guests gathered on the lawn below. It was during this photo session that the unexpected moment occurred. As the photographer called for a wider shot that would include more of the castle's architecture, the bride's bouquet slipped from her hands and tumbled down the chapel steps. The carefully arranged flowers scattered across the stone pathway, and Chen could see the bride's momentary distress as her beautiful bouquet fell apart. Sarah, who had been standing nearby monitoring the floral arrangements, immediately rushed forward to help, but as she hurried toward the scattered flowers, her heel caught on an uneven stone, and she stumbled forward, falling to her knees just a few feet from Chen's position. The accident happened so quickly that most guests didn't notice, their attention focused on the ongoing photography session. But Chen saw everything. Sarah's embarrassed expression as she tried to gather her scattered design tools, the small cut on her knee from the rough stone, and her obvious distress at the disruption to such an important event. For Chen, time seemed to slow as he watched the woman he loved struggle to maintain her composure in front of hundreds of distinguished guests. His training demanded that he remain motionless, that he ignore all distractions and maintain his ceremonial position. But every instinct screamed at him to help Sarah, to abandon protocol and rush to her aid. The internal conflict lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Chen watched as Sarah attempted to stand, clearly embarrassed and trying not to draw attention to herself. A few other event staff members moved to help, but they were still several steps away, and Sarah was obviously struggling with both her injury and her professional pride. In that moment, Chen made a decision that would risk his career, but honor something deeper than military protocol. Without breaking his forward gaze, he shifted his weight slightly and extended his left arm just enough to offer Sarah a steady point of support as she regained her footing. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not watching closely. To most observers, it would appear that the guard had simply adjusted his stance. But Sarah understood immediately, grasping Chen's forearm just long enough to steady herself and rise gracefully to her feet. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly that only Chen could hear. He didn't respond verbally, couldn't even acknowledge her words with a nod, but his eyes flickered briefly toward hers, conveying volumes in that fraction of a second. Sarah quickly gathered her composure and returned to work, helping to reconstruct the bride's bouquet with spare flowers she had anticipated might be needed. Within minutes, the photography session resumed as though nothing had happened. The bride received her repaired bouquet with gratitude, never knowing how close she had come to a minor disaster. Chen resumed his perfect stillness, but his heart raced with the knowledge of what he had done. He had broken protocol, however subtly, to help someone he cared about. The risk was significant, but as he watched Sarah successfully complete her work, ensuring that every floral detail was perfect for the remaining photographs, he felt certain he had made the right choice. The reception that followed was a testament to Sarah's skill and dedication. Her floral arrangements drew compliments from guests throughout the evening, and several people approached her for business cards, promising future commissions. The success she had worked so hard to achieve was secured, in part, by that brief moment of support from Chen. As evening fell and the last guests departed, Chen completed his duty shift and changed out of his ceremonial uniform. He met Sarah at her van as she finished loading her equipment, both of them exhausted but elated by the day's success. "Did anyone notice?" Sarah asked, referring to Chen's subtle assistance during her fall. Chen shook his head. "I don't think so. The photographer was focused on the bride, and most guests were watching the official photos." Sarah reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you for being there when I needed you, even when you couldn't officially be there." Chen smiled, realizing that the day had taught him something important about the nature of duty and service. Sometimes the most honorable action required bending the rules, finding ways to help others even within the constraints of protocol and responsibility. The wedding had been a complete success, with media coverage highlighting both the ceremony's elegance and the perfect coordination of all supporting elements, including the beautiful floral arrangements. Sarah's work received mention in several society publications, launching her career to new heights. Chen's commanding officer reviewed the day's events and found nothing worth comment in the official reports. The subtle nature of his assistance to Sarah had gone unnoticed by security cameras and official observers, leaving him free to continue his service without consequence. In the weeks that followed, Chen reflected on the experience and came to understand that his role as a guard involved more than rigid adherence to rules. Sometimes, honor meant finding ways to serve others, even when duty seemed to forbid it. The most memorable acts of service often occurred in the small moments when human compassion found expression despite official constraints. The wedding became a treasured memory for both Chen and Sarah, representing not just professional achievement, but a deeper understanding of how love and duty could coexist. They had both served their roles perfectly, while finding a way to support each other when it mattered most. Years later, when Chen had advanced in rank and Sarah had built a successful floral design business, they would tell the story of that day to friends and family. It became a symbol of their relationship. Two people dedicated to their respective duties, but always ready to support each other when circumstances demanded it. The wedding photos from that day captured the joy and elegance of the royal celebration, but they could never show the most meaningful moment, a guard's subtle act of kindness that exemplified the best qualities of service, duty, and love. It was a reminder that the most profound acts of honor often happen in silence, witnessed only by those directly involved, but carrying impact far beyond the moment itself. Chen's career continued to flourish. Built on a foundation of professional excellence and personal integrity that had been tested and proven during that memorable wedding day. He learned that true strength as a guard came not from rigid inflexibility, but from the wisdom to know when compassion should guide action, even within the bounds of duty and protocol. The autumn morning carried an unusual chill as Staff Sergeant William Hayes adjusted his uniform for what would be his final shift as a member of the Queen's Guard. After 28 years of distinguished service, Hayes was scheduled to retire the following Monday, ending a career that had defined his entire adult life and earned him the respect of colleagues and superiors alike. At 53, Hayes had seen the Guard through decades of change, from evolving security protocols to shifts in public perception. He had served during royal weddings, state funerals, and countless ceremonial occasions, always maintaining the highest standards of the regiment. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he prepared his uniform, knowing that every detail must be perfect for this final day of duty. Hayes had requested this particular assignment at Buckingham Palace, wanting to conclude his service at the location where he had begun as a nervous 18-year-old recruit. The circular nature of this ending appealed to him, offering closure and continuity to a career that had shaped not just his professional identity, but his character as a man. The sergeant had no family waiting for his retirement. His wife had passed away 6 years earlier after a battle with cancer, and their only child, a son named Michael, had died in Afghanistan while serving with the parachute regiment. Hayes had few close friends outside the military, having devoted himself entirely to his service following these devastating losses. His plan for retirement was simple: a small cottage in the Lake District where he could enjoy the solitude and natural beauty that had always brought him peace during difficult times. He looked forward to reading the military histories that had accumulated on his shelves and perhaps writing his own memoir about the changes he had witnessed during his long career. As Hayes took his position at the palace gates, he reflected on the thousands of shifts that had preceded this one. He had stood guard through rain and sunshine, endured the curiosity of millions of tourists, and maintained his composure through personal tragedies that would have broken lesser men. The role had become more than a job. It was a calling that had sustained him through the darkest periods of his life. The morning proceeded with the familiar rhythm Hayes knew so well. Tourists gathered for photographs. Children stared in wonder at his elaborate uniform, and the occasional visitor attempted to provoke a reaction. Hayes had long since mastered the art of remaining motionless while staying alert to his surroundings, a skill that had served him well throughout his career. Around mid-morning, Hayes noticed an elderly man approaching the barrier with slow, deliberate steps. The visitor appeared to be in his 80s, wearing a carefully pressed suit with several military medals pinned to his jacket. His posture, despite his age, retained the bearing of a career soldier, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence Hayes associated with veteran officers. The elderly man stopped directly in front of Hayes and stood at attention with surprising steadiness for someone of his advanced years. His gaze fixed on Hayes with an intensity that suggested recognition, though Hayes couldn't immediately place the familiar face. "Staff Sergeant Hayes," the elderly man said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I don't expect you to recognize me, but I certainly remember you." Hayes maintained his forward gaze, unable to respond according to protocol, but his mind raced to identify the speaker. The voice triggered memories, but the decades had changed the face enough to make recognition difficult. "My name is Colonel Robert Ashford, retired," the man continued. "I had the privilege of commanding the 1st Battalion when you were a young guardsman. I've followed your career with great interest and considerable pride." The name hit Hayes like a revelation. Colonel Ashford had been his first commanding officer, the man who had shaped his early understanding of military service and personal honor. Ashford had been a legend in the regiment, known for his fairness, his dedication to his men, and his unwavering commitment to the traditions of the Guard. "I heard through the regimental network that today marks your final shift," Ashford said, his voice carrying warmth despite Hayes's inability to respond. "I wanted to be here to witness the conclusion of one of the most distinguished careers I've had the honor to observe." Hayes felt a complex mix of emotions as he processed this unexpected encounter. Colonel Ashford had been more than a commanding officer during Hayes's formative years. He had been a mentor who had seen potential in a working-class recruit from Manchester and had guided his development with patience and wisdom. "You may not remember," Ashford continued, "but 30 years ago, you stood guard during my retirement ceremony. You were so young then, probably 19 or 20, standing at attention while I received my final honors. I remember thinking that you represented the future of the regiment, and I was right." Hayes did remember that ceremony, though he hadn't realized the connection to his current situation. He recalled standing guard while Colonel Ashford received recognition for his decades of service, never imagining that 3 decades later their roles would be reversed. A small crowd of tourists had gathered nearby, intrigued by the elderly gentleman who was speaking to the guard with such obvious respect and familiarity. Some began taking photographs, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, though they couldn't understand the nature of the exchange. "I want you to know," Colonel Ashford said, stepping closer to the barrier, "that your service has honored everything the Queen's Guard represents. Through personal tragedy and professional challenges, You've maintained the standards that make this regiment extraordinary." Hayes felt his composure wavering as he listened to these words from a man whose opinion meant more to him than any official commendation. The colonel's recognition of his personal struggles suggested a level of awareness and caring that Hayes hadn't expected. "I knew your son, Michael," Ashford added softly. "He served briefly under my command before his deployment to Afghanistan. He was a fine soldier and a credit to both his regiment and his father. He spoke of you with immense pride and respect." This revelation nearly broke Hayes's professional demeanor. He had known that Michael had served under various commanders, but he hadn't realized the connection to Colonel Ashford. Hearing that his son had spoken well of him to this respected figure brought a flood of emotions that Hayes struggled to contain. Colonel Ashford reached into his jacket and withdrew a small object that Hayes couldn't see clearly from his position. "I have something that belongs to you," the colonel said, holding up what appeared to be a military medal. "This is your son's military cross, awarded posthumously for his actions in Helmand Province. The presentation was delayed due to administrative issues, but I've arranged to have it properly delivered." Hayes's eyes filled with tears, despite his determination to maintain protocol. He had been told that Michael's medal would arrive eventually, but months had passed without word. To receive it now, during his final shift, and from Colonel Ashford himself, felt like a gift beyond measure. "I know you can't break protocol," Ashford said, "but I need you to know that both you and your son exemplify everything noble about military service. Your dedication, your sacrifice, and your unwavering commitment to duty represent the best of British military tradition." The colonel then did something that surprised everyone present. He stepped back from the barrier, came to attention with impressive precision for a man of his age, and rendered a perfect military salute to Hayes. He held the salute for a full 30 seconds, his eyes locked on Hayes with unmistakable respect and admiration. Hayes felt his heart pounding as he received this unexpected honor from his former commanding officer. Every instinct told him to return the salute, to acknowledge the gesture with the respect it deserved, but his duty required him to remain motionless, to maintain the discipline that had defined his entire career. The tourists around them sensed the significance of the moment, with several capturing the scene on camera. The image of an elderly colonel saluting a stoic guard would later appear in social media posts with captions speculating about the relationship between the two men. After completing his salute, Colonel Ashford approached a nearby security officer and handed over a small package. "Please ensure that Staff Sergeant Hayes receives this at the conclusion of his shift," he instructed. "It contains his son's medal and a personal letter from the Regimental Association." The security officer, recognizing the gravity of the moment, assured the colonel that the package would be delivered immediately after Hayes completed his duty. Other guards who had observed the exchange understood that something significant had occurred, though they couldn't break their own protocol to intervene. Colonel Ashford returned to his position in front of Hayes for a final exchange. "Sergeant, when your shift ends and you're free to speak, I want you to know that it has been my honor to serve alongside you, even across the decades that separated our active service. You represent the finest traditions of the Queen's Guard, and the regiment is better for your service." The elderly colonel then performed another perfect salute before walking slowly away from the palace, his mission complete. Hayes watched him disappear into the crowd. Understanding that he had just experienced one of the most meaningful moments of his entire career, the remainder of Hayes's shift passed in a haze of reflection and emotion. He thought about his journey from young recruit to veteran sergeant, about the lessons learned and the prices paid for a career dedicated to service. He thought about Colonel Ashford's words and the unexpected connection to his lost son. When the changing of the guard ceremony concluded and Hayes was finally relieved of duty, he received the package containing Michael's military cross and a letter from the Regimental Association. The letter, written by Colonel Ashford, detailed Michael's heroic actions in Afghanistan and expressed the regiment's gratitude for the Hayes family's sacrifice. Standing in the guardroom after removing his ceremonial uniform for the final time, Hayes held his son's medal and felt a closure he hadn't expected. The circle that had begun 30 years earlier with a young guardsman watching Colonel Ashford's retirement had completed itself with grace and honor. That evening, Hayes attended a small retirement ceremony with his fellow guards and officers. The official recognition was meaningful, but nothing could match the personal honor he had received from Colonel Ashford that morning. The memory of that salute, rendered with such precision and respect, would sustain him through the quiet years ahead. Hayes eventually moved to his cottage in the Lake District, where he displayed Michael's military cross alongside his own service medals. He often thought about that final day at Buckingham Palace and the elderly colonel who had traveled there simply to honor a soldier's service. The photograph of Colonel Ashford's salute, captured by a tourist and later shared widely on social media, became a symbol of military honor and the bonds that connect soldiers across generations. Though the story behind the image wasn't widely known, those who saw it understood that they had witnessed something profound about duty, respect, and the continuity of military tradition. Years later, when Hayes was asked about his most memorable moment as a member of the Queen's Guard, he would always speak of that final morning when his former commanding officer reminded him that a lifetime of service had mattered, that his sacrifices had meaning, and that both he and his son would be remembered with honor by the regiment they had served so faithfully.